these are the 4 ways that you can be looking at procuring an HPC cluster for your department this year. If you're going to buy it, and this is something that you can order off of the standard government PSPC procurement lists, you're going to have to find a place to put it. And you'll also, of course, have to provide backup capability for these systems. HPCs use much less backup because the data is transient. And of course, you want to budget about 30% for ongoing support. If you're going to timeshare it, SSC does operate the General Purpose Scientific Computing Facility in Dorval. If you get to the cloud, you have a couple of approaches. One of them is to use what's called the IaaS, Infrastructure as a Service model. So we're going to take a standard TensorFlow or OpenAI or other image, a virtual machine image, and we're going to deploy it on a large cluster, virtual cluster in the cloud. You see here's a TensorFlow Linux virtual machine that I can run for $0 to $1 an hour. That's the cost for the software, plus whatever consumption costs Amazon will charge me for the hundreds of nodes that I'm going to use. You're going to have a cluster that is exactly what you want, and we're going to define it and test it, and then save it, turn it off and save it. And when you show up with funding, a bag of money, that's like showing up with a can of gasoline. We're going to pour it in the tank and we're going to fire it up. And we'll run it for as long as your money lasts or until you solve the problem, one or the other. Now, spot instances are something that only exists in the cloud. And what happens there is that you say, I've got my TensorFlow instance. I'll pay up to $1 an hour to run it. If anybody has capacity out there in the cloud that they're not using, or if Amazon has spare capacity, or Azure, then please take this image, run it, and bill me. And strangely enough, that works very well in AI because you're doing a repetitive operation. You have to train the model on 100,000 images or a million images, and you don't really care if it happens in 1 day or 2 days or 3 days, if you can save some money. It's a very strange economics. So the last way of doing it is just to rent it in a software as a service or SaaS model. There are major vendors, Google, Amazon, Azure, who have invested a huge amount of money in developing AI environments. It's probably the environments they use to power their own global, potentially sinister AI operations. So those environments are available to us, and it's going to just be a charge per usage. AI as a service. It can be difficult to find a match between what your users want to do and which vendor offers that exact capacity. I would warn you to avoid getting too deeply involved with any one vendor's framework, because then there's vendor locking. So be very careful getting into an intense close relationship with any of these providers. So we have these 4 ways of delivering AI within the government, and this slide captures my experience of what the different stakeholders prefer. How do you balance these stakeholders? That's what architects and managers do on a daily basis. So how do you choose between these? When I'm having a conversation with the users, I use the Backhoe analogy. In the government, our users are used to asking for the sun and the moon and the stars because they only get funding once every 5 years, and they're going to have to make sure they have enough capacity for anything they might need. So they're going to tell you that this is what they need, a giant bulldozer. Your budget is certainly not going to be able to support that. You might be looking at something a bit smaller. So if you are going to have a heavy-duty, ongoing, multi-year, predictable baseline demand for AI, then you can make a case for buying a $4 million cluster. However, if your business is seasonal or if it's project oriented, if you have a collaboration going on that's going to explore AI in a particular application and you don't know really if it's going to be useful, you do not want to commit that kind of funding. You want to move to a rental model or a leasing model. So you can try that on with your users and put it in terms that everyone can understand. With 2020 hindsight coming out of these projects, I would have liked to propose this to the users. Let me work with you and find a SaaS provider. You can take it for a spin and see what results you get. And we might have a $10,000 budget to run that software for a few hundred hours or whatever. If the results are what you expect, then let's scale it up and make a commitment to having a large leased IaaS cloud cluster. You don't have to have one cluster. If you have several different tasks, then you're going to use several different tools. You can tweak the clusters, whatever you want to do. Save those configurations as your own virtual clusters, and then when the money and the funding hits, we'll hydrate the cluster, add water, add fuel, and hundreds of thousands of dollars is probably the budget for that. In some extreme cases, a phrase I use is when your CFO starts to bleed through his eyes at your monthly Azure or Amazon bill, then you can start to make the accounting argument that it'll be cheaper for us long term to buy a baseline configuration and only use the cloud for what's called bursting when we have extraordinarily large demands.